Here's the part that doesn't add up. You know exactly what a good financial decision looks like. You could explain it to a friend in your sleep. Compare prices before you buy. Read the terms before you subscribe. Sleep on anything over $100. Don't let a countdown timer on a checkout page rush you into anything. You know all of it, cold, without having to think twice. And yet, almost every single night, somewhere between 9 and 11, you do the exact opposite of what you know. You add the item you'd already talked yourself out of at lunch. You upgrade the plan you didn't need yesterday. You skip the comparison tab you had open 20 minutes earlier and just buy the first thing that showed up. But that's the paradox, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move past it. It's not that you don't know better. You know better perfectly well, every single time, and you fail anyway. On a schedule so predictable, you could set a clock to it. If this were really about character, about being disciplined or undisciplined as a person, the failures would land randomly. Some nights you'd slip, some mornings you'd slip. No pattern, just bad luck and bad moods scattered across the calendar. But that's not what happens. It shows up at roughly the same time, in roughly the same shape, night after night, job after job, person after person. And when a failure is that consistent, that repeatable, that tied to the clock rather than to the person, it stops being a story about weak character and starts being a story about biology running on a schedule. Think about how strange that actually is. Once you say it out loud, nobody sits down at their desk at 9 in the morning and decides, today, I'll be careless with money later tonight. Nobody plans the impulse buy in advance. It arrives on its own, uninvited, at almost exactly the same point in the evening it arrived the night before, and the night before that. A pattern that's specific, that repeatable, isn't a character trait showing up at random. It's a mechanism, running quietly in the background of every single day, whether you notice it or not. So let's actually find where it runs out, because once you can see the mechanism clearly, the whole 9 p.m. mystery stops being mysterious. The judges who got harsher before lunch. In 2011, 3 researchers named Shai Danziger, Jonathan Levav, and Leora Avnayam-Pesiso published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at something you would never expect to be this predictable: parole decisions made by real, trained judges in Israel. These aren't random people making gut calls. These are legal professionals with years of experience, working from the same set of facts, the same legal standards, the same training, case after case, day after day. Here's what the data actually showed, and it's worth walking through slowly because the size of the effect is what makes it so hard to dismiss. Early in a session, right after a scheduled break, judges granted favorable parole rulings to roughly 65% of the prisoners in front of them. That's the starting point. As the session continued, with the judges working through case after case with no rest, that number didn't dip a little and hover. It fell steadily, session after session, sliding down towards something close to zero, right before the next scheduled food break. Then, the judges stepped away, ate something, sat for a few minutes, and when they came back, the approval rate didn't creep up slowly. It jumped almost immediately back to that 65% starting point, as if a reset button had been pressed. Same judges, same legal system, same category of cases, often with genuinely comparable facts on paper. And still, a prisoner's odds of getting a favorable ruling depended more on what time of day their case happened to be scheduled than anyone involved would ever want to admit. Sit with what that actually implies. If trained legal professionals, people whose entire job is supposed to be built around consistency and resistance to exactly this kind of bias, still show this curve, then the popular idea that you can simply grit your teeth and stay just as sharp at hour 10 of a long day as you were at hour 1 doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The judges weren't becoming lazier or crueler or less caring about the people in front of them as the day wore on. Something else, something measurable and predictable, was quietly running out underneath the decision itself. So what actually is that thing? Not willpower as a vague word, but the specific resource being spent. That's the next layer worth pulling back. What is actually running out? The concept researchers use to describe this is often called the limited resource model of self-regulation, laid out in a well-known 1998 paper by Roy Baumeister, Ellen Bratzlovsky, Mark Muraven, and Diane Tice. Their core claim, radical at the time, was that self-control doesn't behave like a fixed personality trait, something you either have plenty of or don't. It behaves more like a physical resource, a tank. Something that gets drawn down through use over the course of a day and needs real rest to refill, not just a change of subject or a pep talk. And here's the detail that matters most for everything that follows in this episode. That tank does not appear to care what category of decision is drawing from it. Resisting a tempting snack, staying focused through a boring meeting, holding your tone in a frustrating conversation with a coworker, deciding whether to make an unplanned purchase, all of it seems to pull from the same shared account. Not four separate reservoirs, one for food, one for focus, one for temper, one for money. One single tank, used for anything that requires you to override your first easiest impulse in favor of a more considered one. Now, here's where we need to be honest about the actual state of the science, because the credibility of the rest of this argument depends on not overselling it. The exact mechanism behind this effect, what researchers named ego depletion, is genuinely, seriously debated inside psychology. A large 2016 registered replication effort, led by Michael Hager, involving many independent labs running the same protocol under carefully controlled conditions, tried to reproduce the original lab findings and came back with a much weaker effect than the early studies had suggested. In some replication attempts, barely detectable at all. That's a real, substantial scientific disagreement, and pretending it doesn't exist would undercut everything else this episode is trying to do, which is give you a mechanism you can actually trust. But here's why that ongoing lab debate doesn't sink the larger argument. The researchers who are skeptical of the narrow laboratory version of ego depletion aren't disputing the real-world pattern sitting underneath it. The judges still show that curve, measured against actual outcomes with real stakes, not a lab task with a candy bar. Depleted shoppers, which we'll get into shortly, still buy differently in ways that show up in real purchase data. The precise psychological mechanism behind why might be more complicated, or more conditional, or less universal than the earliest studies claimed. But the pattern itself, decision quality sliding as the day accumulates more decisions, holds up independently of which side eventually wins that specific academic argument about mechanism. What's contested is the why in fine detail. What isn't seriously contested is the what, at the level that matters for your actual life. So if it really is one shared tank, not two separate ones split between life and money, where exactly is the leak happening across an ordinary day? That's worth tracing carefully, because most of it is invisible. The leak nobody names. Here's what almost never gets counted by anyone, including you. A normal workday isn't 10 big decisions. It's hundreds of small ones, and the overwhelming majority of them are invisible even to the person making them. Which email do you answer first, and which one do you let sit? Do you accept this meeting invite or push back and suggest a different time? Is this the right moment in the conversation to raise a concern, or do you let it go for now? Do you approve this request exactly as submitted, or send it back with notes attached? None of these individually feel like spending anything. They feel like just doing your job, the ordinary texture of a normal working day. But under the shared tank model, that's precisely what they are. Withdrawals, every one of them, however small. Each of those choices, however minor it looks on paper, requires you to weigh options and commit to one, which is the same basic mental operation the judges were doing case after case, and the same basic operation you'll be asked to perform tonight when you decide whether to buy something you don't strictly need. None of these small decisions announce themselves as draining, because they don't feel effortful individually. There's no meter on your forehead ticking down with each email you answer. You simply arrive at 6 p.m. with measurably less capacity left than you had at 8 that morning, without a single moment along the way that felt like a cost being paid. This is the leak nobody names, because naming it requires noticing something that, by its very design, doesn't feel like effort while it's happening. Nobody finishes a day of back-to-back meetings and small approvals and consciously thinks, well, I've used up my self-control budget for today. But functionally, mechanically, that's much closer to what actually happened than most people ever give themselves credit for. And the account that gets hit hardest by this invisible, unnamed drain isn't your inbox, and it isn't your calendar. It's whatever decision happens to be waiting for you right after the workday finally ends. For a huge number of people, that decision shows up as a glowing screen and an open shopping cart. Let's look closely at exactly what that moment looks like and why it looks the way it does. The shopping cart at 9 p.m. In 2008, Kathleen Vohs, Roy Baumeister, and their colleagues published research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that connected depleted self-regulation directly to weaker consumer behavior, using real purchasing tasks rather than abstract lab puzzles. Their findings lined up with the judge pattern almost exactly, just moved out of a courtroom and into something closer to a store. When people had already spent meaningful mental resources on earlier decisions in the study, their subsequent shopping behavior changed in specific, measurable ways. They did noticeably less price comparison before choosing. They were more persuadable by whatever pitch or framing was directly in front of them. They made more impulsive choices, faster, with less resistance to whatever option happened to be closest at hand or easiest to select. Now translate that, finding straight into your own evening, because the mechanism doesn't care whether it's a lab task or a real inbox. It isn't that 9 p.m. you is a worse, weaker, or less capable person than 8 mu. It's that 9 p.m. you has been making small withdrawals from the exact same account all day long, across dozens of unnoticed decisions, and now you're being asked to make a careful, considered financial judgment right at the precise moment your capacity for careful, considered judgment is sitting at its lowest point since you woke up. The online cart that's been quietly sitting open since your lunch break suddenly gets checked out without a second thought. The subscription upgrade prompt that 8 a.m. you would have dismissed in half a second, barely registering it as a real decision, gets a yes at 9 p.m. The retailer email that you'd normally scroll past without opening becomes tonight, the exact thing you click on and read all the way through. None of this is a coincidence, in the sense of random bad luck, and it's not a coincidence to the companies designing these prompts either, which we'll get to shortly. What matters here is the direction of cause and effect. It's not that you're simply bad with money once the sun goes down. It's that the same mechanism that made a trained judge's rulings collapse right before lunch is quietly collapsing your resistance right before bed, on the exact same kind of daily, repeating schedule, which raises an obvious, uncomfortable question. If this pattern is this well documented, why does almost all popular money advice act like it doesn't exist at all? Why budget harder advice fails? Walk through the standard personal finance playbook that gets repeated everywhere. Make a budget and stick to it. Track every single expense without fail. Just have more discipline. Resist the urge to buy things you don't strictly need. Notice the assumption sitting quietly underneath all of that advice. An assumption nobody ever says out loud. That your willpower is a flat, constant resource, exactly as available at 11 p.m. as it was at 8 in the morning, refilling itself automatically no matter how the day went. If that assumption were actually true, discipline-based budgeting would work fine for almost everyone, because the same reserve of willpower would be sitting there on tap whenever you happen to need it, day or night. But we've just spent 3 full chapters building the case, from courtrooms to shopping labs, that this assumption is false. The tank drains across the day, measurably and predictably, for trained judges and for ordinary shoppers, and by clear extension, for you in your ordinary working life. Which means discipline-based advice isn't some neutral, harmless suggestion floating in the air. It's advice that's structurally set up to demand the most from you, at precisely the hour you have the least left to give. It's the equivalent of telling someone to run their fastest, most controlled mile at the very tail end of a marathon and then calling it a personal failing when their form falls apart in the last stretch. This is also exactly why the shame that usually comes bundled with this kind of advice is so badly misplaced and honestly kind of cruel in how it's delivered. Feeling guilty about the 9 p.m. impulse purchase doesn't fix anything at all, because guilt doesn't refill a depleted tank. If anything, it adds one more small drain right on top of a reserve that was already running near empty. The honest fix here was never a sturdier, more heroic version of willpower. It's recognizing plainly that the fight is rigged by timing from the start, and building your systems around that reality instead of pretending the rigging isn't there. And once you actually accept that, a whole category of everyday design choices sitting quietly around you starts to look very different and much more deliberate than you'd assumed. Let's look closely at who's already using that timing against you on purpose. The default option trap. When your reserves are running low, the brain doesn't stop making decisions altogether. It just changes its method for making them. It defers, hard and fast, to whatever the path of least resistance happens to be in that exact moment. Whatever's pre-selected, pre-checked, or labeled as recommended gets accepted, not because you carefully evaluated it against an alternative and genuinely agreed, but because evaluating a different option at all would cost mental effort you simply don't have left in reserve. This is the exact insight sitting behind what Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein called choice architecture in their well-known book Nudge, published in 2008. The core idea is straightforward once you see it. Defaults are never neutral. Someone designed them deliberately, usually with a very specific outcome in mind for whoever encounters them. And the businesses that build checkout flows, subscription renewal screens, and upsell prompts know with real precision when a typical customer's resistance tends to be lowest across a normal day. That's not paranoia on your part to notice, and it's not a coincidence on theirs. The extended warranty box that comes pre-checked by default. The subscription that quietly auto-renews and resets your card every single month without asking again. The recommended ad on that surfaces right as you're about to close the tab, dressed up as a helpful suggestion. These features are placed with genuine intention behind them, and they are measurably more effective late at night for the exact biological reason we've spent 5 chapters carefully laying out. None of this means the world is some inescapable trap you're doomed to lose against forever. It means the environment around you contains features specifically engineered to catch you at your single weakest hour. And once you actually know that, it changes what the real fix looks like entirely. The fix was never becoming a tougher, more resistant person who can outmuscle better and better designed defaults. It's making sure that fewer decisions ever reach you at all while you're sitting in that depleted state to begin with, which is a genuinely different project from the one most popular money advice quietly sends you on. Let's define, clearly and specifically, what that better project actually looks like. Reframe the goal. Here's the reframe that everything's in this episode has been building toward, chapter by chapter. The goal was never to build a bigger, sturdier willpower tank through sheer effort. You cannot train your way out of a biological pattern, robust enough to show up consistently in trained legal professionals under real-world stakes. The real, achievable goal is to reduce how many decisions ever have to compete for whatever's left in that shared tank by the time it actually matters most. There are exactly two levers available here, and it's worth naming both of them plainly rather than leaving it vague. Lever 1. Reduce your total daily decision load wherever you genuinely can, which is going to depend heavily on your specific job, your specific calendar, and your specific working life. So we'll leave the details of that one mostly to you. Lever 2. And this is the one this episode can actually help you with directly and concretely. Move financial decisions out of the willpower system entirely, so they no longer need discipline at 9 p.m. because there's simply no live decision left to make at 9 p.m. in the first place. That second lever is where the real leverage sits, because it doesn't depend on you having a good day, a well-rested day, a low-stress day. It works exactly as well on your worst, most depleted day as it does on your best one. Notice what this reframe quietly does to the whole conversation. It takes the fix out of the realm of personality, where you're either the kind of person who has enough discipline or you aren't, and puts it into the realm of design, where the outcome depends on what you set up in advance, not on how strong you feel in the moment. Design beats discipline because design doesn't get tired at 9 p.m. So what does that design actually look like in specific, concrete practice? Let's get into it directly. Automate the decision away. The single's highest leverage move available here is simple to state and genuinely easy to set up. Create an automatic transfer to savings or investment that fires on payday before that money ever sits in a checking account waiting around to become a decision later, at some depleted hour. This works because it happens during the morning of your financial life, so to speak, right when the tank is full, and it happens exactly once, after which it never has to be re-decided again by anyone, least of all a tired version of you at the end of a long day. You're not relying on 9 p.m. you to make the right call under pressure. You've already made the call, back when you actually had the resources available to make it well and calmly. The same underlying logic extends outward into everything else. A preset spending cap on a card removes the need to evaluate every single purchase in the moment it's happening, because the boundary was already set in advance by a version of you with more capacity available. Unsubscribing from retailer email lists removes decisions you never asked for from ever reaching you at all. Since every single promotional email is, structurally speaking, a tiny manufactured invitation to spend willpower you may very well not have left that day. None of these changes are dramatic or difficult. They're small, one-time setup costs, each one paid just once, that buy you out of hundreds and hundreds of repeated depleted decisions stretching out across the months ahead. The best money decision, more often than people expect, is the one you only ever have to make a single time, correctly, and never revisit again. But automation only ever covers the decisions that can genuinely be arranged in advance. Some financial decisions truly cannot be automated away. And for exactly those, timing itself becomes the actual tool you have left. Let's look closely at that. Time your big decisions like the judges got their break. Remember the judges from earlier. Their approval rate reset cleanly back to roughly 65% right after a scheduled break, every single time, with almost mechanical reliability. That's not just an interesting finding about parole boards sitting somewhere far away from your life. It's a direct, practical instruction you can actually use. If timing alone can swing a trained professional's considered judgment that dramatically and that predictably, then timing is a lever available to you as well. Specifically, for the decisions that genuinely require your full judgment and truly cannot just be automated out of existence. A large purchase you've been weighing for a while, negotiating a raise or a new role, comparing two loan offers or two investment options, side by side, line by line. These deserve to happen in the morning, or right after a real break in your day, not squeezed into the last stretch of a long, draining workday when you're effectively operating on parole board hour 9 without realizing it. Treat your own calendar with the same accidental respect the parole board's schedule happened to get. If you already know a significant financial decision is coming up, put it deliberately in the first hour of your day, or right after lunch, on purpose, the same way the judge's approval rate got a deliberate, built-in reset every time they stepped away and ate something. This is the direct, usable payoff of everything the research has shown across this entire episode. Not a personality upgrade you have to earn through sheer grit. A scheduling decision, available to you starting with your very next calendar entry. And if a scheduling decision sounds almost too small and too simple to matter much over the long run, that's absolutely worth addressing head-on, because it compounds in a way that's genuinely easy to underestimate from where you're standing right now. The compounding effect. One depleted decision on one random Tuesday night looks completely trivial in isolation. An extra $10 tacked onto a subscription upgrade you didn't actually need. One skipped price comparison that would have taken 90 seconds. On its own, nobody's entire financial life gets derailed by a single 9 p.m. impulse purchase, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But this was never about a single night. It's the exact same mechanism, firing on the exact same rough daily schedule, across hundreds of working days, stacked up year after year after year. Picture two people with genuinely identical incomes, identical starting points, no difference in raw earning power at all. One of them structures their financial life the way we've laid out across this entire episode. Automated transfers firing on payday before the money is ever a live decision. Big financial choices deliberately scheduled for high-capacity hours, and as few decisions as possible ever left to reach willpower at all. The other relies on nightly discipline to catch every single impulse, every pre-checked default, every quiet auto-renewal, at exactly the hour that discipline happens to be least available to anyone. We are not going to hand you a specific fabricated dollar figure for the gap between those two people over 10 years, because that number would be pure fiction dressed up as data, and this episode has tried to be honest with you the whole way through. But directionally, structurally, across enough years, that gap is real, and it isn't explained by one of those two people being smarter, or more virtuous, or simply born with more discipline than the other. It's explained entirely by one of them designing around a well-documented, predictable pattern, and the other one fighting that same pattern head-on, from a position of weakness every single night, at the worst possible hour anyone could choose to fight it. So here's the full arc, brought all the way back around to where we started. It's one shared tank, not two separate accounts split neatly between life and money, however convenient that split might feel. The judges prove this exact pattern exists in trained, experienced professionals operating under real stakes, not a lab game with no consequences. The shoppers prove that the same precise pattern reaches directly into ordinary purchasing behavior, into real bank accounts, not just hypothetical ones. The fix was never to become someone with a mythically bigger reserve of willpower than everyone else around you. It's to stop scheduling your most important money decisions for the exact hour you're biologically guaranteed to be weakest, and instead build a small system around yourself, automation, sensible defaults, deliberate timing, where the good choice simply doesn't require willpower to win, because the depleted version of you was never handed that decision to make in the first place. Start with one transfer, set to fire automatically on your very next payday, and you've already moved one entire decision out of the danger zone for good, permanently, without needing a single ounce of extra discipline to do it. That's the whole game, and it starts a good deal smaller than most people would ever guess.